Hi, this is Scott Allen, and this module is going to show you how to perform page layouts with CSS. Layout design is all about positioning content so that your users and customers can find the information they need and navigate around the site. We'll be looking at the different positioning options in CSS, like relative, static, absolute, and fixed, and we're also going to look at floating content to the left and right, and building 2- and 3-column layouts, which are quite popular on the web today. The first layout property we'll look at is the position property. You can position any HTML element with one of 4 values. The default position value is static. Static positioning stacks up elements one after the other down the page. Since this is the default, this is what we've been using throughout the course. Each paragraph or div we create will appear underneath the previous div or paragraph. That's what we call the flow of a document. Elements just flow downward. Also, keep in mind the difference between block elements and inline elements. We talked about that in a previous module in the box model module. And remember, inline elements like a span just appear in a line. They don't create a new line. So when I say static positioning stacks elements down the page, then I'm talking about block level elements like div, h1, p, and so forth. Relative positioning, on the other hand, moves an element from its default position in some direction. So for example, if I have a div and I set its position relative, then I can set values for the top and left property to move a relative div a number of pixels away. One thing we'll see in our demo is that once we start to position elements, we have to make sure they have space, because you can position an element on top of another element. Sometimes that's the effect you want, but if not, you'll have to mind the space. 2 other positioning values are absolute and fixed. These values remove an element from the flow of a document, from that flow we talked about earlier. Absolute positioning moves an element to a specific position relative to the body of the document, meaning you can take an element and say, I want this to appear 20 pixels from the top and 50 pixels from the left. And regardless of where this element appears in the markup, it's going to move to that position inside of the page. Fixed positioning is very similar, except the positioning is relative to the window itself. So if I want something with a fixed position, 20 pixels from the left and 20 pixels from the top, it is going to stay at that position even if the user scrolls the window down. That element will always be 20 pixels from the top. Let's see the position values in action. Inside of Visual Studio, I have some markup in place that renders the page we're looking at here on the right-hand side of the screen. There's a fair amount of content in here because I want to use this content to manipulate the layout and positioning of elements. The only styles that are currently applied are styles that will set the margin around these 3 buttons that we see, and a style that will set the width of each of those buttons to be exactly 120 pixels. Since inputs are inline elements, we can see those 3 buttons stacking up against each other and moving out horizontally. Their position is static, so they're following the normal flow of the document, and let's change that up a bit. I want to change this actually just for the last button. So I'm going to say buttons, input, last child. And what we'll do to the last child inside that series of buttons, button number 3, is we'll set, first of all, let's set the position to be relative. And if that's all I do, it doesn't make any changes on the page. But now that I've set it relative, what I can start doing is start manipulating the top and left properties, or the bottom and right properties. So I can say top 20 pixels, left 50 pixels. And if you watch this button, what it's going to do is move down an additional 20 pixels and left an additional 50 pixels from where it should have been. So it's moving relative to where it should have been in the normal flow of the document. You can also specify bottom and right. So if I do that, we move over from the right by 50 pixels and up from the bottom by 20 pixels. But now if I change this back to the way it was, I also want to point out that you can use negative units here. So I can say move up 20 pixels and left 50 pixels, same effect. And in fact, if I move to the left about 185 pixels, then I can position this button almost in the middle between button 1 and button 2. Now you might be looking at this and saying, isn't this sort of similar to margin and padding? Aren't you moving things around by pixels, and can't you do the same thing with margin and padding? And the answer is yes. In many cases, if all you want to do is move something to the left just a few pixels, you could do that with a margin, you could do that with a padding. The difference with relative positioning is that you can actually have something like button 3 sitting directly on top of button 2 and completely ignoring padding and margin and things like that. So if we remove top and refresh, now button 3 is literally overlapping button 1 and button 2. And let's try something else different. Let's try putting top back in, but making this 220 pixels, and now you can see that button 3 is floating over a paragraph that's lower in the page. So you have to be careful with positioning and make sure that you have enough space around your elements if you start moving them around so that they're not overlapping, unless that is the effect that you're trying to achieve. This positioning can be applied to any element. So let's remove the manipulation that we're doing with buttons, put those back in place, and let's go into the page and find this paragraph that is here below the box model heading, and I'm going to give it a class just so I can identify it. Let's just call the class temp. And inside of styles.css, I could say temp, position relative, move down from the top 50 pixels, move in from the left 20 pixels, and now when I refresh, this paragraph should jump, and you can see it's actually overlapping the image that appears below. I could also move it in the opposite direction. And again, you can see that you have to be careful that you have the space to be able to move an element. Unlike applying padding or margin, when the paragraph moves, it's not going to try to push anything out of its way. It's literally just going to jump and sit on top of the other thing. Now let's look at absolute positioning, and I'm going to pick on the last child in that series of input buttons that we have on the page. Now I'm going to set the position to be absolute, and let's say down from the top 20 pixels, over from the left 100 pixels, and now when I refresh the page, that last button should jump up here almost over the H1 heading that we have, and indeed that's where it goes. And now that is its absolute position in this document. So even when I scroll, that button stays up there over top of that H1. When we come back up, it's still there. And that's a little bit different than fixed positioning. So if I set position fixed and save and refresh this page, now that button is in a fixed position relative to the window itself. So it should always be 20 pixels from the top of the window and over right 100 pixels, so that even when I scroll, that button stays in place. Sometimes a website will use fixed positioning to give you a toolbar somewhere on the web page and always have some buttons available for you. Of course, you have to be very careful using fixed positioning or even absolute positioning, because you can never be sure exactly what content it might cover up. The float property is another property that you'll see used extensively in modern web layouts that use just CSS for the layout. A floating element can shift to the left or to the right of a line and then allow content to flow along beside it if there's enough room. For example, I can take a div that is statically positioned and tell it to float left. That would move the div to the left side of the line and will allow another div to float up and appear to the right of that div. I can also tell a div to float clear, and the div will go back into the normal flow. All these effects are best seen in a demo. Here inside of the web page, I want to draw your attention to the image that's in the center of the right-hand side of the screen. An image has a display value of inline block. You might remember we used that a couple modules ago, and that means that the element can have a specific width, like we can give the image a width, and it doesn't force the following content to be on a new line. It can display inline like a span, but it has a specific width like you could typically give to a block element like a div. And that just means that if I remove this break tag that's here, the caption that's inside of a strong element can move up beside the image. And let me give this a little more space and refresh. And you can see that caption's trying to move up there. If it has enough space, the entire caption can be beside the image. And this is interesting, but what if I wanted this caption to appear at the top of this element? In fact, what if I wanted to move additional content up beside the image? There's a couple different ways to do this. One is to do this with align. So I could say align this image to the left. But it turns out that align is actually a deprecated attribute on the image element. We're not supposed to use it anymore. We are supposed to use styles, and specifically the float property. So this image has an ID. It's figure 1. Let's go into styles.css and say that figure 1 should float left. That means move as far left as you can and allow other content to resume their flow beside you. I'm going to put that in there and remove the align. And now we have the same effect. And of course I can also go in and say float to the right. And the image moves as far to the right as it can and allows other content to resume flow on the left-hand side. But for now, let's bring the figure back to the left-hand side. You can see that the text is right up against the image, so we might want to give this a little bit of a margin. Maybe margin to the right of 5 pixels. That'll move the text away a little bit. And now, what would happen if I didn't want all of this content to be floating to the right of this? If I wanted to push, let's say, the next paragraph down below the image, that's when I have to come in and clear something. Now, clears can be a little bit tricky because sometimes you do have to introduce a new HTML element whose only purpose is to clear out content. In other words, one way to solve this would be to use an inline style. And I could say clear both sides. Essentially, don't let things float around. And now that paragraph is pushed down. And if you do not like using inline styles like this, another option would be to put a div in here, and we're going to give it a class of clear. And then I can define a style. Anything that has a clear class should clear on both sides. And that has the same effect. And what would happen if I said clear just on the right side? The paragraph would come back up because it's only looking to clear things that have been floated to the right. If I said clear left, now it is going to push down because it's not going to bump up against anything that is floated to the left. Many times people will just use clear both to make sure that things do not float up against something that is floated either left or right.